Breaking. What just happened on the southern front will go down as one of the most devastating single blows in this entire war. In a matter of minutes, a Russian tank formation, hundreds of armored vehicles, command trucks, and elite officers was wiped off the map. No warning, no escape, just one enormous wall of fire. Satellite images show the smoldering crater where Russia's main base once stood. The same base that Moscow bragged for months was untouchable. It's gone. Flattened. After Ukraine unleashed a strike so precise, so unexpected, that even Russian state media stayed silent for hours, not knowing how to spin the chaos. The scene was hellish. Flames ripping through lines of fuel trucks, ammunition dumps exploding one after another, a firestorm that stretched for kilometers. And at the very center where the Russian commanders had gathered for what they called a final preparation meeting, a single Ukrainian bomb weighing 1,300 kilograms tore through the roof, igniting everything inside. Reports suggest this was no ordinary strike. Ukrainian intelligence had waited, tracked, and timed every move. They knew when the Russian generals would arrive. They knew when the tanks would line up, and when the moment came, they hit with terrifying accuracy. Across Russian telegram channels, panic spread like wildfire. Soldiers posted videos screaming for help, their uniforms scorched, their voices trembling as they begged for evacuation. One message read, "It's gone. Everything's gone. Command is dead." Another soldier whispered into his phone, "They trapped us." They knew. The footage disappeared minutes later, censored by Moscow's propaganda units, but by then, it was too late. The truth was already out. In Kyiv, officials didn't confirm or deny the strike, but the tone was unmistakable. An advisor to the Ukrainian Defense Ministry wrote on X, "Patience is a weapon, timing is victory." That single sentence sent shockwaves across Russian social media. It was the clearest hint yet that Ukraine had been watching, waiting, and choosing the perfect moment to deliver a blow not just to equipment, but to morale, leadership, and pride. Let's picture it. Deep in occupied territory, Russian tanks had gathered in neat rows for inspection. Commanders in polished uniforms stood by, confident and relaxed, believing the front was secure. Drones circled above, not Ukrainian, but their own, monitoring the field. Then, suddenly, the feed goes black. Seconds later, a blinding flash. The ground splits open. Those tanks, symbols of Russian power, turn into burning metal coffins. The entire formation disintegrates in seconds. Military analysts say this wasn't just another airstrike, it was a psychological operation executed with surgical precision. The 1,300 kilograms bombs used in the attack, likely dropped by modified Su-24 jets or delivered via glide bomb conversion, targeted not random bunkers but command nodes, where top officers coordinated the front's logistics. Hitting that site meant cutting the head off an entire regional operation. Without communication, without leadership, chaos spreads fast, and that's exactly what happened. Moscow's first reaction was silence, then came denial. Then, as images started circulating from independent sources, satellite data, drone footage, intercepted communications, they scrambled for an explanation. Some officials claimed it was an accidental explosion caused by fuel mishandling. But the world had already seen the crater, the burned-out skeletons of tanks, and the precision pattern of impact. This wasn't an accident. This was a planned execution. And here's the chilling part: Ukraine waited for weeks. According to several reports, Ukrainian drones had been tracking Russian movements around that base since mid-month. They noticed something unusual, a buildup of armor that didn't move. Then, intercepts confirmed that several high-ranking officers were heading to the location. Ukraine didn't rush. They didn't strike early. They waited until everyone was there, the tanks, the troops, the commanders, and when they finally struck, they struck to erase. Witnesses in nearby villages described the explosion as, like the sky falling. Windows shattered 10 kilometers away. One farmer told reporters, "It was like the earth screamed." Emergency vehicles tried to reach the site, but secondary explosions from the ammunition depots forced them back. Fires burned through the night, visible even from space. NASA's firm's satellite later detected one of the largest thermal anomalies of the war. By morning, Russian bloggers were raging. "Who leaks this location?" one wrote. "How did Ukraine know?" Another furious post read, "We had air defenses. Where were they?" But insiders already knew the answer. Ukraine had jammed communications, spoofed radar, and launched the strike under the cover of decoys. Russian systems didn't even see it coming. The so-called Iron Wall of defense was a paper curtain against modern precision warfare. And as the smoke cleared, Ukraine's plan became undeniable. This was not random luck. This was intelligence-driven warfare at its finest. For months, Kyiv had been improving coordination between its intelligence units and air forces, learning to exploit every weakness in Russia's logistical web. The message was clear. Nowhere is safe anymore, not even the main base. Meanwhile, in Moscow, panic began to ripple through the military hierarchy. Rumors spread that several high-ranking officers had been killed in the blast, including Colonel General Viktor Serov, the regional commander overseeing armored operations in the sector. If true, this would be the most significant single loss of Russian leadership since the early months of the war. Kremlin officials refused to comment, fueling speculation and confusion. And here's what really stings for Russia. This wasn't some faraway missile strike from NATO. This was Ukraine's own operation, carried out with precision and patience. A homegrown act of vengeance executed with Western intelligence but Ukrainian hands. For Moscow, it's humiliation on a scale they can't easily hide. But the question remains, how did Ukraine manage to get such detailed intelligence? How did they know exactly when the commanders would arrive? Who inside Russia might have leaked it? And could this mark the beginning of a new Ukrainian strategy waiting for Russia to concentrate, then striking when it hurts most? Those are the questions shaking every command office in Moscow tonight. And if this was just the first move of a broader operation, Russia may be facing something far worse than just one destroyed base. Because this feels like the start of a new phase. When the smoke cleared over southern Zaporizhia, the world began to realize that what had just happened was not a coincidence. It was a masterclass in deception and patience. Ukraine didn't stumble upon that Russian base. They built a trap. Step by step, week by week. The story starts long before the explosion. Ukrainian intelligence had been watching Russian troop movements through the region for nearly a month. Drones, intercepted phone calls, and satellite surveillance revealed something strange. Convoys of Russian tanks, artillery, and logistics trucks moving in circles, returning again and again to the same location near Tokmak. It looked routine to routine. That was the first clue. Behind the scenes, Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Directorate began mapping the pattern. Every few days, new vehicles arrived, but none left. Russian commanders were turning that site into a major coordination hub, confident it was beyond the reach of Ukrainian airstrikes. They brought in new radar, new electronic jamming systems, even underground bunkers. Moscow's generals called it the fortress. Kyiv called it the target. According to sources close to the operation, Ukraine's reconnaissance drones began flying at higher altitudes, using silent optical sensors instead of transmitting signals that Russian defenses could detect. The footage they captured was chilling. Tank columns lined up in the open, officers walking freely, soldiers relaxing beside fuel trucks. To Ukraine's eyes, it was arrogance. To the commanders planning the strike, it was opportunity. And then came the whisper-intercepted radio chatter, suggesting a senior Russian command delegation would arrive for inspection. That changed everything. Ukraine could have struck earlier. They could have hit the tanks and claimed a victory. But they waited. Because this was never about destroying machines. It was about destroying command. At a secret airfield outside Dnipro, crews prepared the weapons. Modified bombs, massive, 1,300 kilograms each, refitted with glide kits, giving them the range to reach deep into occupied territory. The plan was simple but deadly. Wait for confirmation that the commanders had gathered. Launch a small wave of drones to jam and confuse radar, then release the payload. A single, synchronized strike. What makes this operation even more shocking is how little Russia saw coming. Ukrainian drones circled at high altitude, feeding real-time coordinates to command centers far away. As Russian officers held their briefing inside a reinforced hangar, Ukrainian jets appeared briefly on radar and then vanished. Moments later, from the quiet skies above, death arrived. The first explosion tore through the hangar's roof, igniting ammunition stored underneath. A second blast hit the fuel depot beside it, sending shockwaves that flipped armored vehicles like toys. Within seconds, chaos reigned. Fireballs erupted across the compound, as secondary explosions turned the base into a chain reaction of destruction. One Ukrainian officer, speaking anonymously, described it bluntly. "We didn't strike a base, we erased a brain." Reports indicate that at least 3 senior officers, including Serov, may have been inside at the time. Their deaths would explain the sudden communication blackout across Russian units in the area. For more than 12 hours after the strike, Russian troops operated without direction, cut off, panicking, unsure who was in charge. That confusion alone gave Ukraine an opening to push forward along the flanks. And that's exactly what they did. Ukrainian units near Robotyne advanced under the cover of the chaos, capturing key supply routes and ambushing retreating Russian convoys. Drone footage later showed abandoned vehicles still burning on the roadside. Soldiers fled on foot, leaving behind not just equipment but morale itself. Meanwhile, Moscow struggled to contain the story. State TV ignored the event entirely, while pro-war bloggers demanded answers. One particularly furious Telegram channel posted, "Where were the air defenses? We were told this zone was protected by 400 seconds. Were they asleep?" Another wrote, "The command has been decapitated. The enemy knows our every move." Hours later, both posts disappeared. But the silence from the Kremlin said more than any statement could. Normally, Moscow floods the airwaves with explanations, fake news, Ukrainian provocation, friendly fire. This time, nothing. Just a vacuum. As if admitting that this base existed at all would expose something far worse, the fact that Russia's command structure is breaking down from within. And that's the part few in the West realize. This wasn't just a military loss, it was psychological warfare executed with terrifying precision. Ukraine showed that it can see everything, every convoy, every meeting, every so-called secure bunker. The message was unmistakable. No Russian general is safe anymore. Even NATO intelligence circles privately acknowledged the sophistication of this operation. One Western analyst reportedly said, "This is the kind of trap you only spring once, but it changes everything. Because if Ukraine could do this here, deep behind enemy lines, it means Russia's assumption of safety is gone. Their troops now live in fear of the next invisible strike." What's equally remarkable is the silence on the Ukrainian side. No triumphant announcements, no footage of the strike released to the public, just quiet satisfaction. That restraint itself speaks volumes. It tells Moscow that Ukraine isn't bragging anymore. It's hunting. By the following morning, emergency crews still hadn't extinguished the fires. Satellite images captured columns of black smoke stretching 20 kilometers across the sky. Local witnesses described hearing explosions even at dawn. "It was like thunder that never stopped," one resident said. "The ground kept shaking." Independent analysts later compared the crater patterns to precision-guided bomb signatures consistent with NATO-supplied JDAM or equivalent glide munitions. If that's true, it means Ukraine successfully modified its own delivery systems to carry massive payloads at extreme distances. That kind of innovation terrifies Russian planners. It means even their deepest rear bases are no longer out of reach. And yet, the real damage wasn't physical, it was mental. Within hours, panic spread across other Russian command centers. They ordered all large gatherings of officers cancelled indefinitely. Meetings moved underground. Convoys now travel in smaller groups, constantly changing routes, terrified of becoming the next main base. For soldiers at the front, the message was clear. The commanders can't protect themselves, so how can they protect you? That's how morale collapses, not through words, but through fear. And fear, once it spreads, doesn't stop. By the end of the day, the Russian Defense Ministry issued a short statement blaming a detonation of ammunition due to sabotage. No mention of bombs, no mention of Ukraine, just vague denial wrapped in bureaucratic confusion. But the truth had already crossed every border. Western networks showed satellite footage. Independent journalists verified coordinates. The crater was real, the strike deliberate. This is what makes Ukraine's strategy so effective. They don't need to attack every target, they just need to show they can. One perfect strike sends a message louder than 100 shellings. And this one screamed directly into Moscow's heart. But here's the twist, this attack wasn't the end of the operation. In fact, it triggered something much larger, something the Kremlin never expected. Because as soon as that base went dark, the shockwaves didn't stop at the front lines, they hit the Russian command network all the way back to Belgorod and Rostov. And what followed in the next 48 hours sent Russian leadership into absolute chaos. Stay tuned, because what happened next wasn't just a military disaster, it became a political earthquake shaking the walls of the Kremlin itself. When dawn broke over Moscow, the sky was calm, but inside the Kremlin, it was chaos. Phones rang without end. Reports poured in from the southern front, each one worse than the last. The main base was gone, its command staff either dead or missing, and the armored brigades that depended on it were collapsing into confusion. For the first time since the war began, Russia's central command couldn't locate entire units. It was as if someone had erased them from the map. Across the corridors of power, panic simmered beneath the surface. Senior officials avoided eye contact, whispering in corridors, afraid to speak openly. The Defense Ministry called for an emergency session, but no one had real answers. How did Ukraine know the exact moment when all those commanders were together? Who leaked the coordinates? And why didn't their billion-dollar air defense network even blink before the sky fell? The silence from the generals was deafening. Reports from insiders hinted that several officers were refusing to move their headquarters out of fear of being targeted next. Some demanded to relocate hundreds of kilometers away from the front. Others simply vanished, their phones turned off. Then came the leaks. Russian bloggers, furious and terrified, began posting screenshots from private military chats. "This is a total breakdown," one wrote. "Half our brigade has no communication. Command posts destroyed. Nobody knows who's in charge." Another warned, "We're being hunted. They see us even underground." It sighed. The images that surfaced next were even more shocking. Satellite photos revealed dozens of Russian convoys rerouting north in apparent panic. Supply lines stretched, jammed, disorganized. Soldiers abandoned checkpoints, leaving behind fuel trucks and artillery pieces. One analyst said it looked less like a retreat and more like a stampede. Moscow's propaganda machine tried to regain control. The usual talking heads appeared on television, calling the event an accident, a sabotage by traitors. But the cracks were already visible. Families of the missing officers began demanding answers. Social media filled with grief-stricken posts from wives and mothers asking why their sons hadn't called. For a regime that relies on fear and control, this kind of public outcry was a nightmare. And while Moscow scrambled, Kyiv remained calm. President Zelensky didn't gloat. Instead, he gave a brief, measured statement. When the occupier gathers its strength, it gathers its weakness. We watch, we wait, we strike when it matters most. That message wasn't just for Russians, it was for the world. It told NATO, Washington, and Brussels that Ukraine's strategy had matured. They weren't reacting anymore, they were dictating the tempo of the war. Inside NATO headquarters in Brussels, the mood was electric. Military analysts reviewed the strike frame by frame, amazed by its precision. One senior official reportedly said, "This is what modern asymmetric warfare looks like. Intelligence, patience, and timing, not just firepower." In Washington, the Pentagon quietly confirmed that Western reconnaissance assets had helped provide real-time targeting data, though they refused to comment publicly. But beyond the operational brilliance, there was something deeper happening. A shift in momentum. For months, Russia had been trying to rebuild confidence, telling its people that the war was under control, that Ukraine's counteroffensives were faltering. But now, that illusion was shattered. The destruction of the main base became a metaphor for everything collapsing within Russia itself. Panic began spreading in places far from the battlefield. In Rostov, truck drivers reported long lines as military convoys clogged highways. In Crimea, fuel stations imposed limits as rumors of supply shortages spread. The ripple effect of one airstrike reached across the entire southern front like a tidal wave. And it didn't stop there. Within 48 hours, reports emerged that several other Russian bases had gone silent, no radio signals, no movement. Ukrainian officials wouldn't confirm strikes, but analysts believe Kyiv used the confusion to launch coordinated attacks on nearby logistics hubs. The timing was surgical. While Moscow tried to cover up one disaster, two more erupted behind it. For the Russian public, already weary from economic hardship and isolation, this was a turning point. On state TV, anchors tried to project calm. But on the streets, there was unease. Telegram channels lit up with panic. People whispered that Ukrainian missiles could now hit anywhere, even Moscow. And when rumors spread that Putin had cancelled all public appearances due to security concerns, it only fueled more fear. Western intelligence agencies noticed something else. The Kremlin's inner circle was fracturing. Some oligarchs began quietly moving assets abroad again, fearing a collapse. A few even issued coded statements through business channels, urging peace and stability, the polite Russian way of saying, "End this war before we all burn." Meanwhile, Russian soldiers on the front lines were paying the real price. With supply routes cut and leadership gone, morale sank to new lows. One intercepted call captured a soldier shouting to his commander, "We're sitting ducks, they see us before we even move." The response came cold and resigned, then dig deeper. Inside Russia's defense ministry, the blame game began. Some pointed at electronic warfare failures, others accused traitors within the command, but a few whispered something even more dangerous, that Ukraine might have moles inside Moscow itself. The paranoia spread fast. Within days, counterintelligence agents were arresting their own colleagues, interrogating officers, searching for leaks. But here's what they refused to admit publicly. It wasn't just about intelligence leaks. It was about a system that no longer worked. Layers of bureaucracy, corruption, and complacency had blinded the Russian war machine. And now, one perfectly executed strike had exposed the entire rot. While chaos consumed the Kremlin, Western capitals saw an opportunity. NATO leaders met behind closed doors to discuss new support packages. Poland offered to accelerate deliveries of long-range drones. The U.S. quietly approved another tranche of JDAM kits. Germany announced fresh aid for rebuilding Ukraine's airfields. The message to Moscow was unmistakable. If you can't protect your command, how can you protect your empire? And that empire was trembling. The footage of the burning base played on loop across global media, a symbol of Russia's vulnerability. Every explosion, every smoldering tank, every plume of smoke became part of a new narrative that the once mighty Russian army was being dismantled piece by piece, not by overwhelming force, but by precision and intelligence. Yet amid the devastation, a bigger question loomed. If Ukraine could plan and execute something this flawless, what would come next? Was this a one-time strike, or the beginning of a systematic campaign to decapitate Russia's military leadership? Because deep inside Ukraine's command center, as the data from that operation came in, something extraordinary was happening. Analysts noticed patterns, movements, timing, communication frequencies that hinted at even larger gatherings of Russian forces elsewhere. The kind of gatherings that could become the next main base. And in that moment, one thing became clear. The war had entered a new phase. Not one of grinding trenches or artillery duels, but of surgical, high-intelligence strikes designed to break the Russian machine from the inside out. For the Kremlin, the fear wasn't just of bombs, it was of invisibility. The idea that Ukraine could be watching, waiting, choosing the perfect moment to strike again. And the question now spreading across Moscow, whispered behind every closed door, was terrifyingly simple. Who's next? As the news of the strike tore through Russia's military network, it wasn't just about one base anymore. It was about the realization that the war had changed forever. The sense of control that Moscow had been clinging to for months evaporated overnight. And what replaced it wasn't just fear, it was disbelief. For the first time, Russian generals began to grasp that Ukraine wasn't playing defense anymore. It was hunting. Patiently, surgically, and without warning. The internal panic became impossible to hide. Across multiple regions, Russian command centers went into lockdown. Meetings were moved into underground bunkers, mobile phones were confiscated, and communications were shifted to outdated analog systems because digital ones were being jammed. It was desperation dressed up as caution. Even Putin's own security detail reportedly changed his movements 3 times in one day. The Russian president, usually eager to appear unshaken, had vanished from public view. And out on the front lines, the collapse began to take a human shape. In southern Ukraine, intercepted calls painted a grim picture. Russian units refusing to move forward without air cover, tank crews abandoning vehicles after hearing about the destruction of the main base. One soldier said, his voice shaking, "If they can find our command, they can find us." That single sentence summed up the state of the Russian army better than any report could. Ukraine's leadership, meanwhile, stayed silent but purposeful. Military spokespeople gave measured, disciplined responses, never confirming details, only hinting. It wasn't about bragging, it was about keeping Russia guessing. Each silence became a weapon. Every unanswered question became pressure. And behind closed doors, Ukrainian planners were already studying new targets, using the data from the strike to predict Russia's next move. Western capitals were paying attention. The Pentagon called the operation strategically transformative. British intelligence briefings described it as a blueprint for modern counter-offensive warfare. Germany, once hesitant to deepen involvement, quietly authorized new deliveries of precision-guided munitions. France began expanding its satellite reconnaissance cooperation with Kyiv. NATO as a whole started to reorient, not just around helping Ukraine survive, but helping it win. But the real earthquake wasn't in Brussels, it was in Moscow. Putin's advisors were divided. Some pushed for immediate retaliation, suggesting large-scale missile barrages on Ukrainian cities to restore deterrence. Others warned that doing so would expose Russia's own logistical weakness. They argued, "We can't hit back if we can't even defend ourselves." Those arguments spilled into the open. Telegram channels aligned with Wagner loyalists accused the Kremlin of incompetence, calling the generals blind men in golden offices. It was the same rhetoric that had preceded Prigozhin's mutiny months earlier. But this time, the discontent wasn't coming from one rogue mercenary, it was bubbling up inside the army itself. A colonel in Belgorod posted anonymously, "We are being led by ghosts. Orders change by the hour. Nobody trusts anyone." Within days, several officers were quietly arrested for spreading panic. That word panic was now Russia's greatest enemy. The Russian people felt it too. Gasoline prices spiked overnight. Supermarkets in several regions began rationing supplies again as transport lines faltered. Families of soldiers camped outside government buildings demanding answers about their missing sons. Even the usual pro-war television hosts appeared shaken. One anchor, normally defiant, paused mid-broadcast and whispered, "What are we even fighting for anymore?" The clip went viral before state censors erased it, but by then, millions had already seen it. For Ukraine, this moment was validation. Months of sacrifice, patience, and precision had led to a single blow that rippled across continents. Kyiv's intelligence units released one cryptic statement: "When they mass, we strike. When they hide, we watch." It was as if the entire philosophy of their resistance had been distilled into one line. And make no mistake, the impact reached far beyond the battlefield. International markets reacted. Russian defense stocks plunged. The ruble lost another 10% against the dollar in a single day. Oligarchs began moving assets abroad again, sensing that the tide was turning. Even China, Russia's reluctant partner, issued a carefully worded statement urging de-escalation. In diplomatic language, that was as close as Beijing would come to saying, "You're on your own." NATO officials, in private, admitted what everyone was thinking. This was the moment the balance of power shifted. One official put it bluntly, Ukraine no longer needs to match Russia tank for tank. It just needs to keep hitting where it hurts. Back in Ukraine, civilians gathered in Kyiv's Independence Square, lighting candles not in celebration, but in respect. They knew the cost of every victory. Families held photos of fallen soldiers, whispering prayers for those still at the front. For them, this wasn't revenge, it was survival. The strike on the main base symbolized more than destruction. It meant hope that the occupier wasn't invincible, that patience could defeat brute force. And yet, amid the pride, there was caution. Everyone in Ukraine understood that this war was far from over. The Russians would regroup, they always did. But the difference now was psychological. Every Russian commander, every tank crew, every air defense operator would live with the knowledge that somewhere above them, invisible eyes were watching, waiting for the next perfect moment. As one Ukrainian analyst said, the war is no longer fought in numbers, it's fought in minds. The Kremlin knows this too. That's why, within days of the strike, Putin reportedly ordered an overhaul of command security protocols. Generals were forbidden from gathering in large groups. Communication lines were split into dozens of isolated segments to prevent interception. The army was trying to adapt, but these measures came too late. Once fear infects a system, no order can cure it. And the symbolism of it all couldn't be ignored. That main base wasn't just another installation. It was supposed to represent Russian control, discipline, and dominance. Its destruction exposed what many inside Russia had tried to hide. A brittle military, led by frightened men, sustained by lies. In Western capitals, analysts began to call it the Tokmak turning point. They said it marked the moment when Ukraine proved it could dismantle Russia's military hierarchy piece by piece. The strike became a lesson in modern warfare, how information, patience, and precision can topple even the most fortified empire. And for the Russian people watching from afar, the question was no longer, can we win? It was, how much longer can this last? The Kremlin's silence answers that better than any speech. Because when your commanders are gone, your defense is cracked, and your soldiers running from shadows, what's left to fight for? And maybe that's why, as the fires at the main base finally went dark, the light in Moscow seemed dimmer too. The war that Putin started to conquer Ukraine was now consuming Russia itself. The next phase is coming. The question is, will Moscow survive it? And as always, we'll be watching. So if you want to follow every twist of this turning war, every strike, every collapse, every decision that could end it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because what's happening next might change not just this war, but the future of Europe itself. This war is changing faster than anyone imagined. What just happened at that Russian base might only be the beginning of something far bigger. So if you want to stay one step ahead, don't look away now. Hit like if you stand with Ukraine's fight for survival. Subscribe and turn on notifications because the next video reveals what Moscow is desperately trying to hide. And tell me in the comments, do you think Russia can recover from this? Or has Ukraine just rewritten the entire war? The world is watching. The storm isn't over. and we'll be right here when the next chapter begins.